and jump in. Anna, do you want to start and introduce yourself?
Sure. So I think some of you already know me, but my name is Ana Candida Carneiro. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a playwright, and now I'm a visiting playwright at Amherst College. I am Brazilian. I was born and I grew up in Brazil. Um, and I say I'm Brazilian Italian sometimes because I was also an immigrant in Italy for around 15 years. And also a lot of my playwriting work was, let's say, in Italy and in Italian. So I work a lot, let's say, transculturally across languages, and that's very important for me. So I live fully someone else, Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, welcome, Andrew. So I live fully the discomfort of being an immigrant. Let's say it's a very uncomfortable position in a world that's still very shaped even artistically by nationalism. You know, it's like American theater, Brazilian theater, you know, Italian theater. So that's a lot of my work comes from this, let's say, discomfort. Then I am also the founder and artistic director of the Babel Theater Project, which is a sort of a startup, let's say, startup theater company, nonprofit. I don't even know exactly what it is, but we work with, among other things, we work with immigrant communities in the area of Framingham, Boston. And so yeah, so I think that's a little bit, you know, briefly about my work, and then we can go into the situation. Hank, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Hank Willenbrink, and I'm a playwright. I teach at the University of Scranton, which is a Jesuit university here in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I'm originally from the South. I was born in Kentucky and grew up in Arkansas. Yeah, and I ended up going to grad school in Southern California. Now I have found myself in what's referred to as NEPA here, so northeastern Pennsylvania. I'm, like I said, I'm a playwright. I'm kind of a faculty brat. My dad was a professor and later theater administrator and that kind of thing. And really, what brought Anna and I together in terms of this panel was that we shared an experience, though years apart, in this really amazing theater in Barcelona that's called Sala Beckett. And Sala Beckett is what's referred to as a sala alternativa, which is an independent theater in Barcelona. As Anna was mentioning about kind of nationalism, Barcelona is a really interesting place because they're trying, a lot of the cultural institutions are around promoting a kind of Catalan nationalism and a Catalan national identity for various geopolitical reasons, which I'm sure you've probably come across at some point. But Sala Beckett and a group of other theaters are more independent alternative theaters. And so they, what in particular with Sala Beckett, what's really interesting is that they have a very international reach. They hold, if you go to their website, it's Beckett, just like Samuel Beckett. If you go to their website, they have a really interesting project that has just Catalan plays translated into any number of languages. And over the summer, they have an international playwriting workshop called the Obrador, so the kind of international playwriting workshop. Anna, I forget which year you went. I was there maybe I was there 2 or 3 years ago, and it was led for both. Yeah, it was led for both of us by Simon Stevens, the UK-based playwright, among other things. And so what's really interesting, this was the second opportunity I had to do something like this that was an international thing. The first one was actually in World Interplay, now unfortunately no longer going in Australia. But one of the things that was really interesting, and especially for me, and what kind of led to this conversation with Anna and into some of the stuff we'll talk about and start to explore today, was I would say ways in which I find US-based playwriting to be rather insular and not looking toward an international stage. A lot of the conversations that we have in this country are very, I would say, unique to this country, but they're not conversations that a lot of other people are having. And so when Anna and I met actually at ATHE a couple, 3 or 4 years ago, we kind of realized that we had this Obrador thing in Boston. We had this Obrador thing in common. And so that's what kind of led to us trying to have a conversation about playwriting in a different sort of way. And I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Anna, or if we should just kind of jump in.
Yeah, I think that that was what really sort of like sparked a lot of, conversations between us. I'd like to say that was kind of new actually to the US when we met. I think it was my first ATHE was maybe I was 1.5 years or 2 years in the US. And it was, for me, I was still, understanding things. But I think now we are really, what we would like to propose for this session is really kind of bridging the discourses. Because actually also as, playwright and as like researcher, let's say, I also found out that even focusing in Europe, across Europe, like people don't have that dialogue, even theoretically, with each other, so I really feel there's a need that we really create these bridges. So I think that's what I wanted to say. And I think it's interesting to notice that places like Barcelona, which are places that have been, let's say, that have a history of oppression, let's say, that are linguistically, let's say there's a linguistic minority, that they're bursting in dramaturgical explorations. So I think that's something that we can bring to our discourse at some point. Okay. Should we begin?
Yeah, let's jump in. So the kind of vague idea for this, and both Anna and I will kind of speak back and forth. Like I said, we have some writing prompts. We want to leave some time to just have conversations. This is really just an invitation to discourse and bridging in a particular way. So yeah, and it's kind of framed around this idea of, can we turn away from the idea of I'll lay out the idea of like a workshop into the discourse of aesthetics, and how much would that be helpful to us as writers?
Yeah, just to recap a little bit where we're coming from. So trying to bridge this debate across cultures and continents, the European debate, when I left it, it was 5 years ago, was very much about playwriting aesthetics and the idea of deconstructing Aristotle. How it was really, playwrights were really trying to, Aristotle is neoliberal, Aristotle is no. So let's try to deconstruct it, to reinvent, to push form. This idea that there are no prescribed rules, so the idea of plot is deconstructed, idea of conflict is deconstructed, idea of character is deconstructed, so much that, arrive from degrees of characters that are not even characters anymore. They're linguistic expressions. So there was, really trying to find a vocabulary around this formal experimentation happening. And this is mostly what my PhD dissertation was focusing on. And this idea that the post-dramatic theater, was really the new paradigm, but also not embraced by everybody, because we had, for example, in France, Jean-Pierre Sarrazac, who's a playwright theorist, saying, you know, we don't believe in post-dramatic theater, we believe in rhapsodic theater, the idea of rhapsody. But this idea that drama is not drama anymore, the same drama, it's a mixture. It's like this crazy heterogeneous thing. So like for me, already 5 years ago, it was like something, okay, there's no form that I can, or there are no rules that I can apply to help me find the form in my place. Then when I came here, was more the American debate, which is very important, is still focused a lot on identity. So who is represented on stage? Who has real creative freedom? Like, you know, I don't feel that I have, for example, you know, as a Latina playwright. And who has real voice in theater? You know, so those two debates which seems to be sort of like reproduce a little bit the ideas that we saw before around form and content, or sort of, you know, what composes theater, you know, in these different forms. So so I wanted to go back to the idea of aesthetics because we're exploring this. So let's remember that comes from the Greek aesthesis, which is the perception of the world from the senses. You know, before becoming a philosophical, you know, category, let's say in the 18th century, where it was used to philosophically explore ideas of beauty and work of art. It was for the Greeks, you know, because the word comes from that. That's why I'm going from there. It was really exploration of the senses. Like when this term evolved, you know, in the 20th century, it assumed, but not only in the 20th century, it assumed almost a prescriptive role. You know, if we talk about, you know, which aesthetics are we using to write a play, Aristotle's Poetic has been quite predominant, especially in Western theater. So as you know, I don't need to go through that, you know, but and it still is. If we look at the you know, how playwriting is taught in, you know, American MFAs, you know, it's like it's still very Aristotelian based. This idea also intersects with the idea of technique, meaning like from the Greek, you know, original meaning is the craft or art, right? So it's like the idea that you make something really crafty, and it like philosophically used to be counterposed with the idea of knowledge or episteme. So what is knowledge and what is craft? What is this? Can technique be knowledge? But with time, you know, this term acquired, let's say, meaning around technical like skill or the ability to apply procedures or a method or a framework to something, you know. So so in playwriting, we see a lot of that in like books that we, you know, in the market that we use to teach, or, you know, I personally don't, but, you know, a lot of people use like a technical manual for reading plays. There's other ones, I don't know if you can see, but structure, character, how and what to write, you know. So like really this idea that we as playwrights have to have a technique, have to grasp that to be able to be playwrights, to be able to write a play, right? And what is the problem of seeing playwriting as technical, as a technique for me? So like we use, oh, the nuts and bolts of playwriting, okay? There's an idea, almost a mechanization of what art is. And for me, it reflects a lot the idea of productivity, of capitalism, of specialization. So we have to have that 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 skill to be able to produce something, a product. The play is a product then, you know. And this idea that you know, that it's a means to an end, you know, and we use those technical elements to sort of dominate. So it's a very, actually, you know, sort of male, if you want, you know, if you want to be, if I want to be feminist here, you know, that is what I don't, doesn't resonate so much with me. So what I would like to propose is the idea of playwriting or as aesthetic knowledge of something that emerges from the senses, with the senses, organically. So aesthetic knowledge is embodied, emerges from the senses and not the mind, not the analytical capacities primarily, you know. It's not a priori, is not something that I know a structure like a Freytag pyramid type of thing that I apply, but it's experiential. It's experiential. So how do I experience my play in the making so that I find the structure that is, that, you know, is more organic to the project. Within this framework, the creative process is the path through which the aesthetic knowledge is internalized and externalized in a feedback loop. What do I mean? That the playwright draws from the inner sources to discover shapes and patterns that will then constitute the creation, that is the play in progress, that will then transform and redirect those inner energies in the creator, playwright. So this idea, this conception, this framework does not differentiate between form and content. They are one thing and they emerge in the creative process. Yeah. So those were the first, you know, ideas that I wanted to share. Some of my reflections, stop share. And I know they were a little bit like, but like too compressed, but we can talk about them.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit now too, and then we can come back. I'm really going to be thinking about that sentence. The creative process is the path through which aesthetic knowledge is internalized and externalized in a feedback loop. That I'll be on that for the next 3 weeks. But so let me jump into some of the things that I was kind of thinking of. So about a little bit over a year ago, I got really interested in people who were doing critiques on the contemporary moment and how it intersects with technology. And mainly this had to do with the kind of recognition of how much I was becoming more and more tied to technology. Haha, jokes on me as we assume this. You know, I was very much like ready, like pulling out my phone, looking at email notifications, you know, waiting for the kind of buzz of the New York Times app to tell me like what thing to be outraged about with Trump, you know, on that particular day. And so I started to read, really in anticipation of my son being born, I started to read a bunch of books that kind of looked at ways of dialing back technological use by people like Jaron Lanier, Callum Newport, about things about how to be more human-centered online. But the book that I read that probably stayed with me the most, and I'll put, I'm going to talk about two sources in here, and I'll put both of them in the chat. The first one is How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. Jenny Odell is a visual artist who teaches art at Stanford, which must be a little bit like teaching a dog how to be a robot or something like that, or vice versa. And her book is part artistic musing and part survival guide for the contemporary moment. She draws on a wealth of what we might call performance art, and she has a very expansive definition of art. She says, quote, "The artist creates a structure, whether that's a map or cordoned off area, that holds open a contemplative space against the pressures of habit, familiarity, and distraction that constantly threaten to close it," unquote. She says, art then is a, quote, attention holding architecture. Her idea of doing nothing likewise has far-reaching potential. She states that doing nothing in the sense of refusing productivity and stopping to listen entails an active process of listening that seeks out the effects of racial, environmental, and economic injustice and brings about real change, unquote. She then lists some things that doing nothing can offer us in trying to resist the attention economy. One thing is what she calls repair. That is, it can offer us different spaces of thinking, reflecting, healing, and sustaining ourselves in a way to counteract overstimulation. And then also it sharpens our ability to listen, understanding one another, not through connection and circulation, but through sensitivity. And she says, sensitivity, quote, involves a difficult, awkward, ambiguous encounter between two differently shaped bodies that are themselves ambiguous. And this meeting, this sensing, requires and takes place in time. Not only that, due to the effort of the sensing, the two entities might come away from the encounter a bit different than when they went in, unquote. So a couple points I think that worth just kind of underlining or pausing over a little bit. One is that this idea of ambiguity, neither entity knows itself nor the other. Two, the difference in the two entities. Three, the connection in real time. And four, that change isn't an external act, but involves the work of the sensing and the effort that's put into the sensing. So she says, quote, the practice of doing nothing has something broader to offer us, an antidote to the rhetoric of growth, unquote. So her formulation of doing nothing exists in a spectrum of practices that stand in contrast to dominant modes that we use about when we talk about artistic, and I'll excuse the air quotes here, creation, where one might take a master class. In the field of theater, we often think of skills, and we spell playwright with an W-R-I-G-H-T, like wheelwright, like shipwright. In an almost Apollonian Dionysian split, we make this difference between the idea of play and craft, an object of our worship. The craft part in particular, I would say, is where playwrights seem to hang out most of the time, and as Anna, I think, very illustratively shows us, right? It's also part of this language of capitalism. Production, a particular type of masculinity seems to be woven into our, quote, workshops, right? To hear Eric Bennett tell it in an article that he wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, How Iowa Flattened Literature, the emergence of the Writers' Workshop brings together the Cold War moment, American conservatism and American conservative money, and aesthetics, and that's been able to reproduce itself in campuses all across the world. In addition to giving us a wealth of mid-century and later 20th century American writers like Raymond Carver, John Cheever, Marilyn Robinson, etc., it also foregrounds aspects of craft almost over all else. Bennett says, the thing, quote, the thing to lament is not only that we have a bunch of novels about harpoons and dinghies or suburbs or bad marriages or road trips or offices in New York. The thing to lament is also the dead end of isolation that comes from this describing the dead end of isolation, and from using vibrant literary communities to foster this phenomenon. In our workshops, we simply accept it as true that larger structures of common interest have been destroyed by the atomizing forces of economy and ideology, and what's left to do is to be faithful to the needs of the sentence, unquote. If we were to transfer some of Bennett's critique into Odell's language, we might say that the very attentional structure of the class or the writing workshop creates a type of writing that reinforces the attentional structure that contained it, in its own kind of feedback loop, if you will. What might it mean to have a playwriting hike or a playwriting yoga class? Certainly teachers like Maria-Irene Fornés challenged the workshop mold, but why haven't these types of teaching techniques, note the word choice here, become the rule rather than the exception? foregrounding aesthetics can be a way of wresting control back from a neoliberal productivity-centered educational artistic experience by carving out space for less definable amorphous experience. As Odell states, quote, "What the tastes of neoliberal techno-manifest destiny and the culture of Trump have in common is impatience with anything nuanced, poetic, or less than obvious. Such nothings cannot be tolerated because they cannot be used or appropriated and provide no deliverables," unquote. One aesthetic move that I'd suggest that we could think about is to push away from the primacy of plot and character. Post-dramatic theater, as Anna talked about, which seems to be the calling card of much non-Anglo theater, hasn't had the impact here as much as it has elsewhere. If part of the contemporary moment is realizing and speaking truth to the way that structures have bias, then why not look at the ways in which traditional dramatic structure too locks in racist, patriarchal, and other modes of power? So I think now we shift a little bit as I go through our outline. I think we shift a little bit now to talk about identity, correct, Anna?
Good. Yeah, so this is just to share a little bit of these ideas that, you know, that Hank and I like resonate a lot with. So in terms of the identity, like this question of identity that is so important, we have, you know, to think that our perception, you know, and if we consider the Greek root as aesthesis, perception is not innocent. It's shaped by the cultures that we grow up in and, you know, and are exposed to during our lives. So the forces in our society. So cultures meaning not only national cultures, but the cultures of our, you know, neighborhoods, families, groups, you know. As an example, we cannot even hear certain sounds if our, sorry, I have a typo there, if our ears are not exposed to them since an early age. For example, like I can, like living in Italy for so many years, for 15 years, I still could not listen to certain sounds, like what they would call the double consonants. As a Brazilian grown up in Brazil, you know, my cognitive apparatus could not recognize certain sounds, even after so many years. So likewise, we tend to perceive structures that are known to us and in consequence also reproduce these same structures because they are comfortable, because that's what we know. So yeah, I mean, you know, we all know about this, you know, figure games of the Gestalt, about flipping the perspective, what we can perceive, what we immediately perceive, and what we're actually missing for not having, you know, another perspective. So what I want to propose is like seeing the creative process as an aesthetic process, meaning that there is sort of a fruitful interaction between aesthesis, senses, perception, and identity formation, and also work around our identity. So as we write our plays, we have contents, and you know, I didn't want to separate, because I think that pattern is content, but we have patterns, we have images that emerge in our writing, and we create dialogue with this, let's call it material, with this material that comes out organically out of us. And in the interaction with that material, there is a heightened awareness. We become aware of structures that we have internalized. For example, I might be tempted to write a play in the dramatic form because I've been so conditioned to reading plays or seeing plays in that way. And I can only reproduce that. And I'm very good at reproducing that. you know. But if I want to step back and question this cognitive, this aesthetic, you know, this process, then I'm going to be aware of what I am reproducing, you know. I'm gonna be more aware of my bias. For example, if I create a character, there is like stereotypical, if I'm working with characters, if I create a character that is a little bit, you know, that, you know, that can generate sort of racist content, you know, so then I can, there is a feedback loop. Then I go back to myself and I repropose that. So it's not just getting in touch with the patterns that we have organically inside of us, you know, like not just applying Aristotelian principles because that's what is taught and that is the skills that, you know, we as playwrights have to know. No, but I'm also questioning whatever I am producing. I'm becoming more aware, and in this process, there's an inner transformation along with the generation of the artwork. And the artwork is not seen as a product. It's really valuable in the process. And that's how what I'm calling aesthetic knowledge is created. So yeah, around question of whiteness that I've been thinking so much about in, you know, recently. And the question of white beauty in playwriting, meaning what is white aesthetic in playwriting, you know, and it's like, for me, it's Anglo, it's Eurocentric, and we have been all shaped by it, including me, you know, all playwrights, because that's what is predominant. That is the paradigm. So to do like anti-racism, anti-oppression and decolonial work in playwriting means digging deep into our channels of perceptions, exploding some crystallized ideas of beauty that we have, and questioning, sorry for the typo, assumed knowledges that we have about art, what is good and what is bad, you know. For example, it is very common, for example, in like playwriting, like selections, you know, the idea that if you have diversity, you are lowering the quality. But that means from the perspective of whiteness, you know, because like whiteness is still very much connected, at least in America, with the dramatic form and with the Aristotelian, you know, parameters of character, plot, etc. So the question that I would like to, you know, ask you now is, how do we open ourselves to these different types of beauty or different types of aesthetic enjoyment that can disrupt our perception? If you have ideas on that, I would like you to share or write down, and we can talk about this later after Hank shares his ideas.
I screenshotted that amazing graphic. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time as well. And I think like after this, we'll just kind of open it up to a larger conversation that we can have around a lot of these things. So when the question or topic of identity shows up as a white cisgendered hetero guy, which I figured I could underscore no better than by wearing a Western shirt today. I really try to be the person that listens. If I'm in a room like this, if I'm teaching, because of the privilege that I have, I tend to be the one who speaks about that. I tend to think that this is a good practice to, that when I'm asked to represent others, I'll at least have attempted to put the time into listening, but I don't think it's ideal. I will admit these days, I worry that people who don't know me might start to get the wrong impression of me. My wife is Colombian. We've been together for 10 plus years. And at this point, I've I would say I've worked most of those 10 years at trying to get the best understanding of her as I can, even if I get checked every once in a while that there are certain things that lived experience that I won't be able to penetrate in her understanding. Anyway, so I've got a lot of what I would call Spanish language subcultural swag. I have records from obscure Argentinian bands like Pescado Rabioso. I've got a collection of Don Ramon t-shirts, who's this kind of drunkard guy from a Mexican children's show that was broadcast all over Latin America. I have my most recent thing is a Father's Day hat that says affectionately Papi. But I do wonder, am I culturally appropriating this? If identity is essentialized, then yeah, probably I am. If we think about identity as an element of cultural practice, you might afford me more leeway. The practice of culture isn't unlike the practice of being a decent person. You have to keep coming back to it. No one says a serial killer was a good guy just because he left extraordinary tips. It's this continual practice, this kind of ritualized elements of who we are that help construct us and which likewise become what we practice. In the case of my wife and I, the dance between lived experience and dedicated practitioner has worked so far, but I'm also aware that in certain ways she authenticates me. And one of the most important things for me is that I don't take that for granted. And so I feel like there's an analogy that I'm trying to draw out here between writing, which is that we have to authenticate our worlds, but we have to be sure that our readers trust our authentication. And to do that, we have to practice. But that might be obvious. So what if we flip it? How can we be sure that we're not imposing our aesthetics, our cultural practice on what we're reading for, say, play selections? How do we extend ourselves into others' work with sensitivity? And perhaps I think I may have sketched that out already. Listening, locating ourselves, practicing rather than appropriating, and never taking anything for granted. In a certain way, I think probably what I'm trying to articulate here is against the idea of identity as an essentialized or the idea of a super identity. And if you want something that speaks about this, I recommend the Ezra Klein recent book, Why We're Polarized, where he talks about the creation of super identities, among other things. I worry that American theater becomes capital A, American, capital T, theater. And as I was saying earlier, really kind of closes itself off to a lot of other voices. A couple years ago in an ATHE panel, I was alarmed to see that in playwriting classes only there are very few authors who are international who are taught in playwriting classes. Thinking about those sorts of things, not just leaving authors from outside the United States into theater history classes, for example, I think would be a very good step toward trying to think of ourselves again in a kind of global context.